haven't checked the weather yet, but I know it is the perfect day to chat about adult Jewish literature. I'm Cheryl Stahl. Thanks for joining me here at Nice Jewish Books. I had the pleasure of meeting Maggie Anton years ago when she was doing research for her book, Rav Chisda's Daughter, at Hebrew Union College, where I was a librarian. I've had the pleasure of meeting with her on and off since then at AJL conferences and Jewish events, and we spoke about her earlier book, The Choice. So today, I'm especially happy to welcome Maggie Anton back to talk about her latest book, The Midwives Escape. Welcome, Maggie.
Well, it's like I'm glad to be here. I'm here in my office at home, so I would be here anyway.
Well, it is lovely to see you.
Yes.
So usually I start by asking the author to tell me about their book. But instead I'm going to tell you about it, and you tell me all the things I've got wrong.
Okay. I better have another bit of coffee here, rev up my brain.
Go for it. So this is a story that revolves around the Exodus and what happened when the Jews left Egypt. So the Jews left Egypt all by themselves with the things they could carry on their back and things that they could pillage from the Egyptians. And then they wandered without stopping in the desert for 40 years with no GPS, no stopping and asking for directions.
Okay, that's already two things.
Yes.
Two things wrong. First of all, back then they weren't the Jews. They were the Israelites.
Great point. Thank you.
They didn't get to be Jews. Only the tribe of Judah eventually got to be Jews. And then, so I think there weren't actually Jews as opposed to Hebrews or Israelites until there were Christians. Anyway, so there's one piece of information. And the other thing you mentioned, the Jews did not wander in the desert for 40 years. They actually didn't wander very long at all. I mean, they followed God's cloud that kind of took them around. And when you read the piece of Exodus about this in the Torah, there's a chunk of time, like 35 years, that nothing. The Torah says nothing. They're not wandering around. They have camped at Kadesh Barnea, and the next thing you know, it's 35 years later, and Miriam has just died at Kadesh Barnea, which actually is an oasis in Israel that is in the south of Israel near like Solomon's, what used to be Solomon's copper mines. So they're way down in the south of Israel. And essentially they stayed there for the 35 years in which the Torah is absolutely silent. And archaeologists have found, Kadesh Barnea is a very nice vacation place now. It's wintertime in Israel. But anyway, they stayed there, and Kadesh Barnea is right on a trade route between the Mediterranean Sea to the west. And already in Israel, along the Mediterranean Sea, there was a lot of trading because Egypt was down at the south end of it, and Anatolia, which is now Turkey, was at the north end of it. And it's right along the sea. So you have traders coming from all over the place in the Mediterranean. But at the other end of the trading route, which would be essentially where Eilat is, you have all the traders from Babylonia, from India, from Africa, because they're coming from the east. And that's probably one of the reasons they stayed at Kadesh Barnea, because they could earn some income when they learned how to make stuff that they could trade. They didn't have to travel to do any trading. They set up their booths and their tables. And Kadesh Barnea is there's a river runs through there, the lake now.
Okay, so you did an amazing job kind of filling in that 35-year gap. And you told it through the eyes of a couple of the midwives. So one
Right.
thing you didn't correct me on is that I had it in my head that only the Israelites left, but in fact, other people left with them. So will you talk about the other people and then who your main characters are?
Okay, well, the other people's, okay, in order to write this book, I joined the Biblical Archaeology Society, otherwise known as BAR.
I think their journal, BAR, is the Biblical Archaeology Review.
And they are amazing. They have been in business. I wouldn't call it business, but they've been doing their thing for I think almost 50 years. And as soon as I discovered them, I joined because it's not very expensive for joining a organization that is going to send you a very informative um, magazine quarterly. But the thing that's really great is all 50 years of all their magazines, all their books, all the articles that various members have written is accessible on the internet if you're a member.
It's an amazing resource.
So it was an amazing resource. And we coincidentally were going to Israel that summer because my now 15-year-old grandson wanted to have a bar mitzvah in Israel. All right, back to who was the mixed multitude, or the Erev Rav, as they call it in the Bible. One of the things I learned in the Bible Society, Archaeology Society, is that what they call the 12th century, the end of the Bronze Age collapse. They've actually dated it to 1188 BCC, when there was like an incredible drought and famine all along the Mediterranean, except for Egypt, because Egypt doesn't worry about rain. They get the Nile coming down and providing water all the time. So, but all these other peoples had to, they they packed up and went to Egypt where they were going to sit out the drought, which is essentially what, Jacob's family did. When there was a drought, they went down to Egypt as well. So one of those things that from the Torah is not merely legend, but is actually really happened. And, they have the evidence. And anyway, there was close to a dozen different peoples who came to Egypt during the time of that drought. And let's see if I can remember. There were the Hittites, there were the Philistines, the sea, all these various different sea peoples, like from Crete and from the north. And also the Canaanites came down there. That's how the Israel people came. But anyway, and there was Lagash and people from Babylonia. It was
The
a
Nubians.
really quite extensive famine. Ah, yes, the Nubians are the same as the Cushites, which actually clears up some things about the Cushite woman that Moses married. Was same as a Nubian, who apparently, okay, the Hittites had been at on and off war with Egypt for centuries, and during the time they were not at war, then the Pharaoh's daughters would marry the princes of Anatolia, which is where the Hittites came from. But and the Hittites were such great warriors, they would rent themselves out as mercenaries. So at this time, they were the guards in Egypt. They were the mercenaries who, if they weren't fighting your army, then they would help you fight some other army. And remember from the Bible, we have Uriah the Hittite, that Bathsheba's husband, poor husband, that David sends off into, and who's like a general in the army, and David puts him at the front line. So the Hittites were one of those. And so I decided to use the Hittites as my male major characters. And then, of course, the Egyptian midwives would be the main female characters. Only we only see everything from the midwives' perspective. The Hittites are there and they're heroes, but we don't ever hear them talk to us in the first person like the midwives do. But anyway, at this time period, which they say is the archaeologists say is 1188 BCE. To me, it's amazing they can establish the date so accurately.
Really, yeah.
That many years ago.
And so when the Israelites left, a lot of those people left with them. So it wasn't just the Israelites.
Exactly. If you
traveling to Kadesh Barnea, it was these other groups as well.
Right. Well, let's face it, whether you're an Israelite or a Hittite or a Cushite, if you were in Egypt when the plagues hit and you saw that the Egyptian gods were absolutely impotent to do anything, and you saw how powerful the Israelites' God was, you'd probably say, "Okay, I'm going to go with the Israelites." I don't think people were all that fussy about what God they were worshiping when they were just idols. But the Israelite God put on a very impressive, powerful show. Some of which, I mean, having a plague that only kills the firstborn, not the secondborn, but only the firstborn, is a pretty miraculous thing, as opposed to locusts, which come all the time.
Right. Something that's very specific and targeted, not just general.
Yeah, very targeted.
So tell me more about the midwives, Asenath and Shiphrah.
Asenath is the mother, and Shiphrah is her daughter, who's her apprentice. And Asenath has a sister, Pua. I used those names from the Egyptian midwives, who is married to a Israelite man. There was a lot of intermarriage in those days. People may complain about intermarriage now, but I would say that probably the majority of the non-Israelites who left Egypt with the Israelites had a family member who was an Israelite, so that they had incentives, and they would have seen the plagues hit their family, whereas any of the Israelites who had intermarried, the plagues wouldn't have hit them because the Israelites would have done the Passover stuff and put the lamb's blood around their doors.
So that's the motivation of the non-Israelites, but why would the Israelites marry out?
Well, first of all, if you're an Israelite, if being married to an Egyptian or a Hittite or whoever else there was, you probably wouldn't have been enslaved.
Uh-huh. Right. Okay. So let's get back to Asenath and Shiphrah and Pua.
Okay, so they've been living in Egypt for a few generations, and when the plagues happen, Asenath's husband and son, who are firstborns, die right there in their house during the night. So if that's not a show of power by the Israelite gods, or how, which god do you want to be your protector? Egyptian gods didn't do anything. And your sister, who is married to an Israelite, is leaving anyway. Once the group of people are out after they've had their 40 years, they go out and not scout. They're going to find some land in Canaan that they're going to live in. And they have battles with all these different peoples that I had never heard of. But this is where the archaeologists come in and say, no, all those battles that are described in the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy didn't happen then. They happened during the time of the kings, when Saul and King David are fighting the Philistines and other peoples. And you can see the difference between well, let's just say a city that has fallen down because of an earthquake and a city that was destroyed in a battle.
Mm-hmm.
At least archaeologists can do that. And one of the things that I do in Midwives Escape is the very end. They're coming into Jericho, which actually had fallen down, but it had they had carbon dating and that kind of stuff. Now it had fallen down hundreds of years earlier, and people still were living in it. It had fallen down from an earthquake.
Fascinating.
And so it wasn't that difficult for the Israelites. They walk around it for 7 days and make the inhabitants very nervous. But once you have still thousands of people jumping down, up and down and stamping their feet and yelling loudly, and you have a place that's already partway fallen down because of an earthquake, it doesn't take that much to get more of the walls to fall down. So the walls of Jericho did fall down, but it wasn't a giant attack by the Israelites and the other people that were there with the Israelites.
So I want to go back to Kadesh Barnea, because you came up with
Yes.
a ton of fascinating things. So I'm kind of assuming that most of these you found in your research and not out of your imagination, but I want to check in with you.
Most of them.
Babies and mothers didn't die at childbirth when they first left.
Yeah, that's straight out of the Torah.
It is. Okay.
Right at those years.
Okay, shame on me for not rereading it.
Oh, no, but come on, you got to read the Torah with a magnifying glass to come up with all these little tidbits of information. One of the things that God promises the Israelites after, I believe it's at Sinai, is that their women will not die in childbirth. This is God's promise to them while they're before they've gotten to Canaan. And I think I quoted Torah somewhere in there where God says this. But of course, all the men who were old enough, they all got, none of them got to get into the promised land. They all died. And Rashi was the one that tells us that little story about how Tisha B'Av came to be a day of mourning.
Okay, so I was going to ask you about that next. So tell me about Tisha B'Av and the men dying.
Right. Okay. So at the point where, at a certain point, God thinks they're close to being able to stand on their own feet, and they send out spies to the promised land, to Canaan, to report back what it's like there, so people would be all excited and enthusiastic about moving on to the promised land. Although, frankly, for everything I've seen about Kadesh Barnea, I wouldn't necessarily want to leave it. I mean, it is a very beautiful oasis.
Right, and many of the Israelites didn't want to.
Right, and actually the tribes of Simeon or Simon, that's their land. I mean, Kadesh Barnea is in Israel still, as well as the land. I think the Solomon's copper mines are still in business. I mean, they're still mining there. Anyway, so they sent out men from each of the 12 tribes to be spies. And when they came back, 10 of them said, "We're terrified. We don't want to live there. Lands of giants and mean people, and we don't want to go." They didn't say we want to stay in Kadesh Barnea, but that is apparently logically what they did. They didn't want to go wander around anymore, and they liked where they were staying. So the spies had a good reason for saying, we're fine here. But anyway, so they didn't want to go, except for Joshua and Caleb. And of course, God is really angry with the other 10 that says they don't want to go, and says, "Okay, you don't want to go? You guys are going to die here. And it's going to be your sons, your next generation who's going to go." So, and I was amazed to find Rashi was the guy who tells us this, that God didn't want to kill all the people who were out spying and their age range. It's like everybody who's over the age of 25 is not going to live to get into the promised land. I'm going to wait for the next generation who won't have done any spying. Let them be the new leaders. So instead, one thing God made easy for all the Israelites was, instead of having First of all, instead of having the entire generation of the people who were the spies die at once, you would have had like every male over the age of 25 would have died more or less at once.
Utterly traumatic.
Yes, and also if you're trying to make a life in Kadesh Barnea and you need to have some skills and have some items to trade with when the caravans come through. Anyway, so God didn't do that. God had I guess 1/40th or 1/35th, anyway, something, 1% of the males died on Tisha B'Av, first year in their beds or whatever. And then no men died the rest of the year, the older men. But on Tisha B'Av, the second year, another batch of the older men died. And the ones who were left weren't stupid. I mean, they noticed, whoa, nobody dies during the year except for this day. We're going to make it simple on ourselves. We're going to have those guys dig their own graves and lay down in them at night. And if they're one of the group that is destined to die that night, they'll be dead in the morning and we just bury them. So
easy to say that, but how traumatic for the families to go out to the graves in the morning.
Right, waiting to see who's going to...
Wondering,
who's going to come up. And
am I going to see...
I have that scene where they have to wake up the grandfather by bringing him some, fried onions, and that nice scent would wake them up. Anyway, so they 1/40th or 1/35th by the time you get to Tisha B'Av, the guys that night are going to dig their graves and hope that they're awake in them in the morning. And so you get to the 40th year, 35th year, however, Rashi says the 40th year. So you get to the 40th year, Tisha B'Av, and everybody wakes up. I mean, all the guys who were old and in their graves, their beds, they all climb out. Oh, wait a second. So they didn't have calendars that good. And so they'd say, oh, we must have miscalculated the date. Tisha B'Av is probably tomorrow. So they go back and they lay down in their graves again. But the next morning, they all get up again. And actually, you end up with a very nice pun that my husband, well, no, some puns aren't nice. But anyway, a pun that my husband pointed out, if people were speaking English, you could say there was mourning in the morning of, of Tisha B'Av.
Yeah.
Oh,
and let me just throw in, so Tisha B'Av is the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av.
And eventually there are things that happen on that day that people mourn for. But Rashi throws in this particular little scene. Anyway, so once, as you said, it's the 9th. So they're not, and they don't have good calendars. So they think, okay, they'll stay in their graves another night and we'll see what happens. And they all get up the next day. And finally you get to Tu B'Av, which is a full moon. It's the 15th of the month. Believe me, Passover starts the 15th of the month, and there's that big full moon for you. So when they saw the full moon and everybody was still alive, they realized they had gone past Tisha B'Av. Nobody died. So all the guys who were supposed to die before we could go into the promised land are dead. Now it's time to leave, or at least time for the men of army age to start going and conquering the promised land. The women, most of them stayed in Kadesh Barnea because by that time they had a nice trading post and the caravans are going by there regularly. And I mean, in terms of why did they have just, God, it was not a punishment to stay at Kadesh Barnea. This is how all these people who were slaves, who never ruled themselves, who just followed orders from the Egyptians, they managed to turn themselves into a society, into a community. They learned new skills that they could do business off of. So they needed those 40 years to get their society functional.
And they also had the safety net of having the manna still every day,
yes,
while they were learning to hunt and fish and gather and all those other things.
Right. Make olive oil. There's still olive trees there. Olive trees live tremendously long lives. So they turned into a society, and the different groups that had left together kind of besides just marrying each other, they learned from each other, because people from different ethnicities in Egypt would have had different skills that they did. And that was part of the really fun research that I had done. I already knew how you make date beer, because Rav Hizda did that. But I learned how you make olive oil. I learned how you make goat cheese, which we still have these days. And they had the manna, and the animals ate the manna. So I imagined that the goat cheese would have been like really tasty, having come from, goats that were eating manna also. And I couldn't resist making a save the cat moment.
They found some orphan wild cats that they raised.
Save the cat moments are like a trope for showing that your characters are good, nice people. That they find a way to save the cat, or in our case, two cats.
It's wonderful. So you mentioned some of your earlier work. So Rashi's Daughter took place in the 11th century CE. And then Rav Chisda, you went back 700 years. And all of a sudden you pop into the 20th century with The Choice in the 1950s. And now you're back
way back
2,500, 3,000 years. So what inspired you to swing the pendulum way back the other way?
Well, actually, it was seeing Prince of Egypt, because we see it every year, and watching all of the people leave as they're singing Mi Chamocha, which was really, that was, if you were Jewish and you knew Mi Chamocha, that was a very emotional moment. But to see some of the mixed multitude intrigued me. And I wasn't going to write about the 1950s anymore. That book was one and done. And I was wondering, what it would be like. What was it like? And since the only female Egyptians that we ever hear about in the Torah are the midwives, I thought, they won't be the exact midwives that we have, but I certainly felt no guilt giving them the same names. I mean, these people are not going to sue me. And I love doing research, especially into the lives of women. And there was, that's why I joined the Biblical Archaeology Society, and discovered that there was a lot of very recent, when I say recent, I mean archaeologically recent, so maybe the last 50, 100 years, the archaeologists in Israel and in Egypt and in other places are literally digging up all.
They suddenly discovered that women existed in the past also?
Somewhat. They did. One of the things that I thought was, there are a lot of stuff I learned that I thought I can throw into this book and people are going to learn a lot, that them being midwives, Egypt already had forceps.
Wow.
What some obstetricians, the solid spoons for if the mother can't push the baby out, then we can give her some help and pull the baby out when she's pushing. And there's a lot of, the herbs and medicinal things that, frankly, they had in Rashi's Daughter's time and that they had in Rav Hizda's time.
Yeah. So you mentioned birth control.
Yeah, they knew. They had certain, spices and herbs that would, and I don't know what they are, but they knew, but they were back then. So that would prevent conception. They certainly had drugs and herbs that would cause a abortion.
So why did you decide to tell your story from the non-Israelite point of view? I mean, the Israelites they're very much involved in the story, but it's from the point of view of the outsiders.
Okay, for two reasons. I actually, for the first time in my life, read the Torah word from word, starting at Exodus, all the way until they came into, till the end of Deuteronomy. That I read very carefully with the idea of how do I know what it would be really like for these women and for the men also. And I noticed, okay, most of the time when you're reading the yearly cycle of the Torah, most people don't ever get to Joshua. It's the Haftorah for the very last section of Deuteronomy. And so I actually read all the Haftorahs also. And I get to the one about Joshua, and I read that there was no circumcisions going on during the so-called 40 years.
Really?
The number 40 is a biblical number. That's what the archaeologists call it. So, but during the time that they were coming into Canaan, they didn't circumcise any of the men. I mean, you needed to have fighters at the ready. They didn't say that, but they didn't circumcise anybody. So when they get to Jericho, Joshua says, okay, we're here, we're crossing the Jordan, and all the men have to be circumcised.
Ouch.
At this point, I guess for the men, it's too late to turn around and go back to Egypt. At that point, every man who is circumcised becomes an Israelite. It's a giant conversion for all the men. Just like today, if a man is, a convert, although let's face it, in modern times, most men are circumcised as babies, whether they're Jewish or not. So they circumcise all the men, and they wait for them to heal, and then they attack Jericho. And so I realized, oh my God, you had all these thousands of converts right at that time. It wasn't just the tribes. You had a whole lot and Joshua actually says, you are going to be Israel, as opposed to Judah or Simeon or God. Anyway, GAD.
Fascinating.
So I'm married to a convert. My daughter is married to a convert. So I particularly wanted to show off converts at their best.
That's wonderful. And I'm sorry, I'm laughing. I'm just thinking of them going back to their wives and, hi, honey, how was the war? And they're like, yeah, something happened. So do you have any projects in the works? Do you have a new century or millennium that you're going to be diving into next?
Funny you should ask. One of the things that we didn't mention was about the character in Midwives, Sarah bat Asher, who left with the Israelites and is mentioned in the census of the people who left with Jacob and met up with Joseph and became slaves for the most part. She was there. So she was in the first census of people that came in, the 70 that left with Joseph's family. And then lo and behold, there's another census before they actually enter the promised land. So, but this is 5 generations later, and she's coming in to the promised land with them. So the rabbis, of course, met, they saw this and going, whoa, who is this woman who lived so long? So they started coming up with all these incredible midrash stories about her, that she doesn't die. That when the brothers had come back from Egypt and come to tell Jacob that they're afraid to tell him that Joseph is still alive because he's so old that this might be such a shock for him, it'll send him over the edge. So they asked Sarah if she plays the lyre and she sings, if she could kind of gently come up with a song or some way to tell Jacob that his son is alive. She gives him the news. He is so thrilled to hear that Joseph is alive and doing well in Egypt, and everybody else. And he's also so pleased that she told him in such a way that he didn't have a stroke or heart attack. And so he blesses her. This is all Talmudic. Blesses her by saying, the angel of death will have no power over you. And lo and behold, that's what happened. She lives. There's questions whether she actually ever dies. But she is alive all the way through Talmudic times, and she corrects them when they're discussing the Exodus. She corrects them as what really happened.
Huh.
So I thought, okay, this is a way, from another female perspective, I could cover like 1,000 years of Jewish history, David and Goliath and Solomon and Esther and all this. So I'm doing research on all the most interesting places where she would have been an eyewitness.
Wow. Interesting.
But once I learned there was this woman, and the rabbis say that every time in the Bible you hear about the wise woman of so and so, of some place, it's her.
All right. Sounds like it's going to be fascinating. So, my typical last question is to give you a chance to put out a call for tikkun olam, for repairing the world. What would you like to speak out for?
Here, I'm ready on this one. Okay, as I said, according to the archaeologists who know what they're doing, there were no wars or battles when the Israelites came into Canaan. Those all happened in King David, King Saul's time. They came into Canaan, and there's a debate on whether there weren't still some Israelites left there. Not all of them came into Egypt. In any case, there were the Canaanites are living, and if you've ever been to Israel, you know that there's the hill area and the flat area.
Mm-hmm.
And the flat area is where you can very nicely grow wheat and barley. And up on the hill area is where you can have vineyards and olive trees. But there was nobody living in the hill areas because there was plenty of room on the flats and way less work to farm that area. So they're not going to go up in the hills, and we have to terrace them, and we have to plant trees that take 100 years before they're going to make any olives. We see them now, but anyway, the point being is the Canaanites and the Israelites lived like right next to each other. They traded with each other. Archaeologists see that they have the exact same 4-room houses. The Canaanites probably, obviously had them first, and they can carbon date to when those dwellings were built and when were the hill dwellings built. So they know the Israelites came later and the Canaanites. I mean, let's face it, the Israelites were living in Canaan when they went to Egypt, and they essentially came back. And the way the archaeologists know is, okay, when they're excavating the dwellings, the houses of the people in the flatlands. Of course, archaeologists love to dig up the remains of the hearths so they can see what people were eating.
Mm-hmm.
So, and with carbon dating, you can tell when they were eating that. So they found that the Canaanites had the remains of cattle, the remains of sheep and goats, and some wild birds. There were not domesticated birds then, and pigs.
Really?
And you go up to the hills, and the dwellings there, their hearths, well, they got the remains of oxen, they got remains of cattle, sheep, goats, maybe, birds if, you could catch them, but no pork.
Wow, interesting.
And you go over the hills all the way to the other side by the ocean where the Philistines are, and there's more remains of pork than anything. That's what the Philistines like to eat. And you could by looking at their hearths, see what peoples were there. And the Israelites were not eating, or at least a group of people were not eating pork way back then, with proof on it. And we know what dates they weren't eating pork. So I'd say, and the archaeologists also say reasonably, this is where the Israelites were. And they were already, for whatever it was, the reason they didn't eat pork. But that's how they know the Israelites were there back 1000 BCE.
Okay, so how is this a call for tikkun olam?
Because the Palestinians and the Israelites are both indigenous peoples, or at least indigenous from 4,000 years ago. They shared the land then. And apparently they got along well enough that they fought the Philistines together.
So it sounds like you're saying if we did it once, we can do it again.
Absolutely. And I think one of the main barriers to peace is that nobody knows the history. And there's enough land for everybody.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that. Maggie, if people want to contact you, what is the best way?
The best way is my email, maggieanton@gmail.com. No spaces between Maggie and Anton. I answer my emails eventually.
And your website?
My website is also www.maggieanton.com.
All right, great.
And you can go on there and you'll see all my books, and there's book group discussion questions and all that kind of stuff. And one last tidbit, because I never had this on any of my other books, is Midwives Escape. There's 25 chapters. It's not that long because the book isn't even 300 pages. And we have illustrations that my husband, the retired attorney turned artist, drew.
Ah, okay. I did notice those.
Yeah, so you have one from the sand cats.
Yeah, I see one of the olive press and an olive tree, the date collection. Yeah, they're wonderful. All right. So, Maggie Anton, thank you so much for speaking with me about your latest book, The Midwives Escape. If you are interested in any of the books we discussed today, you can find them at your favorite board and brick or online bookstore or at your local library. Thanks to Dianki for use of his Freilich, which definitely makes me happy. This podcast is a project of the Association of Jewish Libraries, and you can find more about it at www.jewishlibraries.org/nicejewishbooks. I would like to thank AJL and my podcast mentor, Heidi Rabinowitz. Keep listening for the promo for her latest episode.
Hi, this is Miri Leshem Peli, author and illustrator of A Feather, a Pebble, a Shell. I'll be joining you soon on the Book of Life podcast, and I'd like to dedicate this episode to my parents, whose love of nature has always inspired me.
The Book of Life is the sister podcast of Nice Jewish Books. I'm your host, Heidi Rabinowitz, and I podcast about Jewish Kidlit. Join me to hear my conversation with author-illustrator Miri Leshem Peli about A Feather, a Pebble, a Shell at bookoflifepodcast.com.